Before we begin, please like and subscribe, it means a lot. Thank you. The last time a human knelt before General Karvosh, he had torn the man's throat out with his secondary mandibles just to hear how the translator would render the screaming. Now, standing on the bridge of his dreadnought with 17 conquered systems behind him and to the frozen ball of New Tasmania below, Karvosh clicked those same mandibles in anticipation. The human colony, barely 5,000 souls clinging to ice and stone, would provide perhaps 10 minutes of entertainment before joining the archive of dead worlds he had collected like trophies. "Humans will kneel," he broadcast, savoring the words as they echoed across his bridge. The response came through crackling static, a single male voice cutting through the interference with the weight of absolute certainty. "You'll kneel when your legs are broken." Karvosh's tactical officer recoiled at the insolence. The humans, soft, fleshy creatures who had barely achieved interstellar flight 2 centuries ago, dared threaten the hegemony's finest military commander. The general's compound eyes swept across his bridge crew, noting their shared incredulity. These were veterans who had reduced proud civilizations to ash and memory, who had watched entire species prostrate themselves rather than face extinction. "Deploy the shock battalions," Karvosh ordered, his voice carrying the casual indifference of one ordering breakfast. "Let them learn what defiance costs." The human colony of New Tasmania wasn't supposed to be here. When the hegemony scouts had mapped this sector 40 cycles ago, the planet had been empty, a worthless ball of ice and stone orbiting a dying star. But humans, in their peculiar way, had seen potential where others saw desolation. They had carved cities from permafrost, coaxed crops from frozen soil, and somehow thrived where any sensible species would have starved. Admiral Jonathan Reeves watched the hegemony dropships pierce the atmosphere from his command bunker 3 kilometers beneath New Tasmania's surface. At 63, he was old for a soldier, his once dark hair now iron grey, his hands steady despite the arthritis that plagued him on cold mornings. He had fought in the border wars, had seen what humans could do when cornered, and more importantly, what they chose not to do when given alternatives. "They're landing in force, sir," reported Lieutenant Colonel David Park, his fingers dancing across the tactical display. "Estimate 30,000 troops, heavy armor support." "And our defenses?" Reeves asked, though he already knew the answer. 300 Marines, sir. The colonial militia brings us to maybe 2,000, if we count the ones who actually showed up for training." The odds were laughable. By any conventional military calculation, New Tasmania would fall within hours. The hegemony's shock troops were gene-crafted killing machines, each one capable of tearing through a dozen humans without breaking stride. Their armor could shrug off small arms fire, their weapons could punch through reinforced concrete. But Reeves had studied history, real history, not the sanitized versions taught in Federation schools. He knew about Thermopylae, about Rorke's Drift, about the Winter War. He knew that humans had a peculiar relationship with impossible odds. "Activate Protocol 7, he said quietly. Park's hands froze over his console. "Sir, Protocol 7 requires—" "I know what it requires, Colonel. Do it." Above them, the first wave of hegemony troops hit the ground running, their exoskeletons hissing as they adapted to New Tasmania's gravity. Squad leader Vextar led his unit through the empty streets of the capital, confused by the absence of resistance. Where were the defenders? Where were the screaming civilians, the futile barricades, the desperate last stands? The city was a ghost town, windows dark, streets bare of even fresh snow. Their thermal sensors picked up nothing but the background heat of the geothermal plants that powered the colony. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished. "Command, this is Vextar. The city appears to be abandoned. Requesting instructions." Karvosh frowned at the report. Humans were cowards, yes, but not even they would abandon an entire colony without a fight. It had to be a trap. But what kind? His sensors showed no energy signatures, no weapons emplacements, no signs of ambush. "Proceed to the primary objectives," he ordered. "Secure the spaceport and the government complex. They're hiding somewhere." As Vextar's unit approached the government complex, Private First Class Miguel Santos watched them through a scope from 2 kilometers away. At 19, he was the youngest member of Reeves's improvised defense force, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the cold. The heating elements in his suit had failed an hour ago, and New Tasmania's -40 temperature was seeping through every joint and seal. "Steady, Santos," whispered Sergeant Major James Crawford, lying prone beside him. Crawford was old school, a veteran of more battles than Santos had years of life. "Remember your breathing." "They're just walking in," Santos muttered, "like they own the place." "Let them," Crawford replied. "The Admiral knows what he's doing." In the command bunker, Reeves watched the hegemony forces spread through his city like oil through water. They were efficient. He had to give them that. Their formations were textbook perfect, their coverage overlapping, their advance methodical. In a conventional battle, they would be unstoppable. But this wasn't going to be a conventional battle. "Sir," Park reported, "they've taken the bait. Primary forces concentrated in the government district. Secondary units spreading through the industrial sector." "How many?" 90% of their ground forces are now within the city limits." Reeves closed his eyes, thinking of the families they'd evacuated to the deep shelters, the children who would grow up remembering this day. History would judge him for what came next, but history was written by the living. Execute. The first sign Vextar had that something was wrong was when his exoskeleton's joints began to seize. The sophisticated servo motors that multiplied his strength and speed ground to a halt, leaving him frozen mid-stride. Around him, his entire squad was experiencing the same malfunction. Warriors turned to statues in the span of heartbeats. "What's happening?" someone screamed over the comm. Then Vextar felt it. A tingling sensation on his exposed skin, the only part of him not covered by armor. He tried to look down, but couldn't move his head. The tingling became burning, and he realized with growing horror what the humans had done. Nanites, microscopic machines smaller than dust motes, filling the very air they breathed. But not the weaponized versions banned by every civilized species. These were simpler, more elegant. They didn't attack living tissue, didn't replicate uncontrollably. They simply sought out complex electronics and metal alloys, bonding with them at the molecular level, turning advanced machinery into dead weight. All across New Tasmania, 30,000 of the hegemony's finest warriors found themselves trapped in their own armor, their weapons fused into useless lumps, their communications reduced to static. The gene-crafted soldiers who could tear through humans like paper were now monuments to their own technological dependence. Santos watched through his scope as the aliens struggled against their frozen armor. Some managed to trigger emergency releases, spilling out of their exoskeletons, only to find themselves nearly naked in temperatures that would kill them in minutes. Others remained trapped, their enhanced strength useless against joints that no longer responded. "Now?" he asked Crawford. "Not yet," the Sergeant Major replied. "Wait for the signal." In orbit, General Karavosh was screaming at his communication officer, demanding answers that wouldn't come. 90% of his ground force had gone silent simultaneously. The remaining units, held in reserve outside the city, reported no enemy contact, no weapons fire, nothing but an eerie silence from the capital. "Launch the second wave," he ordered. "Full bombardment authorization. Level the city." "Sir," his weapons officer said hesitantly, "our troops are already lost," Karvosh snarled. "The humans have shown their hand. Now we show ours." But as the hegemony's orbital weapons powered up, alarms began screaming across the bridge. Karvosh spun to see human ships emerging from hyperspace, not the cobbled-together merchant vessels and obsolete frigates intelligence had reported, but sleek, angular predators bristling with weapons he didn't recognize. Captain Thomas Scott stood on the bridge of the UES Perseverance, watching the hegemony fleet scramble to respond. At 41, he had spent half his life preparing for this moment, training on simulators, studying alien tactics, waiting for the day humanity would have to show its true face. "All ships, this is Perseverance Actual," he said calmly. "You know your targets. Fire when ready." The weapons humanity unleashed weren't plasma cannons or particle beams. They were something far simpler and far more terrifying. Relativistic kill vehicles, chunks of metal accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. No shields could stop them, no armor could withstand them. They were the universe's simplest weapons, requiring nothing but energy and timing. Karvosh watched his proud fleet die in silence. Ships that had conquered worlds simply ceased to exist, their atoms scattered across the void. There was no drama to it, no spectacular explosions. One moment they were there, the next they weren't. "How?" he whispered. His tactical officer, one of the few still functioning, pulled up sensor data with shaking appendages. "Sir, those projectiles, they were launched weeks ago, precisely timed to arrive just as we entered orbit. The humans knew we were coming before we even decided to come here. On the surface, Admiral Reeves gave the order Santos had been waiting for. All units, advance. Rules of engagement. Accept surrenders, provide medical aid, minimize casualties. We're not them." Santos rose from his position, his ancient chemical propellant rifle feeling primitive compared to the weapons the aliens had carried. But it worked in any temperature, required no power source, and could put a round through an unarmored target at 500 meters. The battle for New Tasmania wasn't a battle at all. It was a methodical process of collection as human forces moved through the city gathering prisoners. Some aliens had managed to escape their armor, only to succumb to the cold. Others remained trapped, slowly freezing as their suits' power reserves dwindled. The lucky ones were those who surrendered quickly, who allowed themselves to be led to heated shelters where human medics waited. Crawford found Vextar still frozen in the government complex plaza, his armor covered in a thin layer of frost. The aliens' eyes, all 6 of them, tracked the human's movement, showing intelligence despite the paralysis. "Can you understand me?" Crawford asked. A tinny, translated voice emerged from the armor's speakers, apparently the only system still partially functional. "Yes. Your general wanted us to kneel," Crawford said, checking his rifle. "But here's the thing about humans. We've got a long memory for that kind of demand. Our ancestors knelt to kings and emperors, to dictators and tyrants. We knelt until our knees were bloody, and then one day we decided we'd had enough." He gestured to Santos, who helped him lift the frozen alien onto a transport sled. "We're taking you somewhere warm. Your armor's toast, but our medics will make sure you survive. That's the difference between us and you. We know what it's like to be on our knees." In orbit, the Perseverance had closed to visual range with Karvosh's flagship. The general stood on his bridge, watching the human vessel approach, knowing his remaining weapons were useless against whatever technology allowed them to time relativistic strikes with such precision. Captain Scott's face appeared on his view screen, and Karvosh was struck by how ordinary he looked. No scales, no natural armor, no redundant organs, just soft flesh wrapped around fragile bones. How had such creatures become so dangerous? "General Karvosh," Scott said formally, "I'm prepared to accept your surrender. Your ground forces are in our custody. Your fleet is destroyed. Further resistance serves no purpose." "You knew," Karvosh said. "You knew we were coming before we even decided to attack." "How?" Scott's expression didn't change. "We've been watching you for years, General." Every species you've conquered, every world you've claimed. We saw the pattern, calculated the probabilities. New Tasmania was bait, a colony placed precisely where your expansionist doctrine would demand you take it. You sacrificed an entire colony as bait. No, Scott said quietly. We built a colony to save the rest. Every human on New Tasmania volunteered, knowing what would happen. They wanted to be the line where your expansion stopped. Karvosh's legs trembled, a physiological response his species experienced only in moments of complete defeat. The human hadn't been making an idle threat in that first transmission. I offer unconditional surrender, he managed. Good, Scott replied. We'll discuss terms. But first, I need you to do something for me. What? Kneel. The command bridge of the Hegemony flagship fell silent. For a member of Karvosh's species, kneeling was not just submission. It was an acknowledgement that the victor could claim everything, including the right to existence itself. No Hegemony general had knelt in 3,000 years. Slowly, hydraulic joints hissing, General Karvosh lowered himself to the deck. His legs folded beneath him in a way that would have been excruciating for a human, but was merely deeply shameful for his kind. Around him, his bridge crew followed suit, until the entire command staff of the Hegemony's proudest fleet knelt before the image of a single human. Now we can begin, Scott said. In the deep shelters of New Tasmania, families emerged to find their world transformed. The empty city was filling with prisoners of war, aliens who had come as conquerors now dependent on human mercy for survival. Children who had hidden in darkness saw their first Hegemony warrior not as a triumphant victor, but as a shivering figure wrapped in thermal blankets, sipping hot soup with trembling appendages. Lieutenant Aaron Walsh, the colony's emergency coordinator, found himself managing the largest POW camp in human history. The Hegemony troops, once freed from their armor, proved surprisingly docile. They were soldiers, not fanatics, and without their technology, they were just cold, frightened beings far from home. "Sir," one of his aides reported, "the Hegemony troops are asking about their families. They want to know if they'll ever see them again." Walsh looked out at the rows of temporary shelters they directed, at the human medics moving between them, at the guards who carried food more often than weapons. "Tell them the truth," he said. "That depends entirely on what their government does next." Admiral Reeves stood in the plaza where Vextar had been captured, studying the frozen Hegemony armor that still littered the streets. In a few hours, recovery teams would begin the process of cataloging and studying the technology. Humanity would learn from it, as they always did, taking what was useful and discarding what made species weak. Park approached, tablet in hand. "Sir, final casualty report. Let's hear it." Hegemony forces, 30,000 captured, approximately 300 dead from exposure. Our forces, 17 wounded, mostly minor injuries from the cold. No deaths. Reeves nodded slowly. And the civilians? All accounted for. The shelters held. Good. He looked up at the stars visible through New Tasmania's thin atmosphere. "Send word to Earth. Tell them Protocol 7 worked, but we need to accelerate the timeline." "Sir?" "The Hegemony was just the first, Colonel. They're the youngest expansionist power, the most predictable. The others will have learned from this. Next time, we won't have the luxury of choosing the battlefield." As Park moved to comply, Reeves allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Humans had knelt for too long, to too many masters, but they had learned from each genuflection, had studied those who stood above them, had prepared for the day when they would rise. On the bridge of the Perseverance, Captain Scott received a priority transmission from Earth. The encryption was maximum level, the kind used only for messages that could reshape humanity's future. He read it twice, then called his senior staff to the briefing room. "Orders from the Council," he said without preamble. The hegemony capitulation is confirmed. Their remaining systems have agreed to terms. But intelligence indicates 3 other expansionist powers are mobilizing. Commander Lisa Park, no relation to the Lieutenant Colonel on New Tasmania, pulled up the stellar maps. The Ordinate, the Synthesis, and the Crowned Republic. Each one makes the hegemony look like beginners. Which is why we're accelerating Phase 2, Scott said. He input his command codes, revealing a section of the star map previously hidden. These are the real human colonies. 200 systems, 17 years of secret expansion. While we let the galaxy think we had a dozen worlds, we've been building an empire. His officers stared at the map in stunned silence. The scale was staggering. Humanity controlled more territory than any 3 other species combined, all of it hidden by careful misdirection and the galaxy's own prejudices about human limitations. The Council has decided it's time to stop hiding, Scott continued. The hegemony action was a test case. We've proven we can defeat a modern military power without revealing our full capabilities. Now we prepare for the real war. All of them at once? Park asked. If necessary. Scott stood, hands clasped behind his back. For 2 centuries, we've watched other species prey on the weak, enslave the defenseless, destroy what they couldn't control. We told ourselves we were being patient, strategic. But the truth is simpler. We were afraid of what we might become if we acted. He gestured to the viewports where Karvosh's crippled flagship drifted under guard. Today we made them kneel. Tomorrow we'll have to decide what kind of victors we'll be. Whether we'll be better than those who came before, or just another empire built on others' bones. On New Tasmania, night was falling over the colony. The Nanites had been deactivated, their simple programming exhausted, leaving billions of microscopic corpses to be swept away by the wind. The hegemony armor stood like monuments to a failed invasion, frost-covered metal reflecting the lights of a city coming back to life. Santos found himself on guard duty at Shelter 7, where 1,000 hegemony troops huddled around heating units. One of them, smaller than the rest, approached the fence line. Santos tensed, then relaxed as he realized it was carrying something, a small device that projected holographic images. The alien held it up, and Santos saw what looked like family images, smaller versions of the creature, possibly children, in what must have been their home. The universal constant of soldiers far from home, showing pictures of why they fought. Yeah, Santos said quietly, pulling out his own phone to show images of his younger sister back on Earth. I get it. They stood there in the cold, 2 soldiers on opposite sides of a fence, sharing the only thing that truly mattered. In the morning, the politicians would arrive. Treaties would be negotiated, territories redrawn, the future of 2 civilizations decided in conference rooms far from the battlefield. But for now, in the frozen night of New Tasmania, there was just the quiet understanding that everyone, human or alien, had someone they wanted to see again. Admiral Reeves watched from his office window as the first transport ships began arriving to process the prisoners. Soon, the hegemony troops would be shipped to holding facilities, then eventually home as part of whatever agreement the diplomats reached. The crisis was over, at least for now. But his secure terminal showed a different story. Reports were flooding in from across human space, shipyards working triple shifts, training centers filled to capacity, entire moons being hollowed out for resources. Humanity was mobilizing on a scale not seen since the colonial wars. The door chimed, and Crawford entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through 40 years of service. Begging the Admiral's pardon, the Sergeant Major said, but you might want to see this. He handed over a tablet showing surveillance footage from the POW camps. Hegemony troops were teaching human guards their language, sharing technical knowledge, explaining the weak points in their own armor designs, not under interrogation, but voluntarily. "They're choosing sides," Crawford observed. "They know what's coming, and they'd rather stand with us than against us." Reeves studied the footage, noting how the guards responded. Not with suspicion, but with the careful respect soldiers showed to potential allies. "What's your assessment, Sergeant Major?" "Honestly, sir," Crawford set down the tablet, "I think we won too easily. The hegemony folded because they were bullies, not warriors. But the others, the ones who've held their empires for millennia, they won't make the same mistakes." "Agreed. Recommendations: stop fighting the last war, start preparing for the next one. And maybe," Crawford paused, choosing his words carefully, "maybe consider that making them kneel isn't the same as making them stay down. The hegemony kneeled, and now they're helping us. Perhaps that's worth more than conquest." After Crawford left, Reeves returned to his window. The city below was fully illuminated now, humans and aliens working side by side to clear the frozen armor from the streets. It was a small thing, but symbols mattered. His comm unit buzzed with another priority message. The Synthesis had issued a formal condemnation of humanity's unprovoked aggression against the hegemony. The Crowned Republic was calling for a general conclave to discuss the human threat. The Ordinate remained silent, which was somehow more ominous than any declaration. Reeves opened a secure channel to Earth, knowing his recommendation would reach the highest levels within hours. The time for hiding was over. But perhaps the time for conquest didn't have to begin. Perhaps there was another way, one that no species had tried because it required something more difficult than strength. It required trust. In the government complex plaza where Vextar had fallen, human engineers were studying the frozen armor. But they weren't alone. Hegemony prisoners who had volunteered their expertise worked alongside them, explaining systems, pointing out vulnerabilities, sharing knowledge that their own government would have executed them for revealing. One of the engineers, Marcus Kim, found himself working next to the alien who had led the assault. Vextar, now wrapped in human cold weather gear that fit poorly on his frame, was sketching power distribution nodes on a tablet. "Why help us?" Kim asked during a break. "Your people will call you a traitor." Vextar's translation unit rendered his response in flat, mechanical tones, but Kim thought he detected emotion beneath it. "My people sent me to die for expansion. Your people saved me despite victory. Which one deserves loyalty?" It was a simple statement that carried profound implications. If the hegemony's soldiers could be turned not through force, but through mercy, what did that mean for the coming conflicts? As the night deepened, reports continued to flow. The human fleet that had ambushed Karvosh was already gone, scattered to positions unknown. But throughout human space, similar fleets were taking position, preparing for threats that might never come, or might arrive tomorrow. Captain Scott stood on his bridge, reading the latest intelligence updates. The Synthesis was mobilizing its biological weapons, the Crowned Republic its AI-driven armadas, the Ordinate its reality-warping technologies. Each one represented a threat that could end humanity if they weren't careful. But he also read the reports from New Tasmania, saw the images of former enemies working together, and wondered if Admiral Reeves might be onto something. Perhaps the greatest human strength wasn't their endurance, or their cunning, or their carefully hidden military might. Perhaps it was their ability to turn enemies into allies, to show mercy when none was expected, to offer a hand up to those they had brought to their knees. His orders were clear: prepare for war with 3 galactic powers. But orders could be interpreted, and the Council had always valued initiative in its commanders. "Navigation," he said quietly. "Plot a course for Synthesis border space." "Sir, our orders are to protect humanity. Sometimes the best protection isn't a weapon, it's a conversation." As the Perseverance turned toward its new heading, Scott thought about the general who had kneeled on his bridge. Karvosh was still aboard, technically a prisoner, but increasingly treated as an advisor. The hegemony general had spent hours explaining the political dynamics of the galaxy's powers, insights no human intelligence service could have gathered. Perhaps that was the key. Not to break their enemies' legs, but to give them a reason to stand beside humanity instead of against it. The stars wheeled overhead as ships and species moved toward an uncertain future. On New Tasmania, humans and aliens worked through the night to repair a world that had been saved by sacrifice and strategy. In the depths of space, fleets prepared for wars that might reshape the galaxy. And in a small shelter on the edge of the colony, Santos shared his rations with a hegemony soldier who had tried to kill him 12 hours earlier. They couldn't speak each other's language, but they understood the universal truth, that tomorrow was coming whether they faced it as enemies or allies. Admiral Reeves finished his final report as dawn broke over New Tasmania. The planet's star was weak, barely warming the frozen surface, but it was enough to paint the ice in shades of gold and crimson. Beautiful in its way. He had commanded the defense of an entire world, had broken one of the galaxy's premier military forces without firing a shot. By any measure, he should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt the weight of what came next. The secure communication from Earth contained a single line that changed everything. The Ordnate Fleet has entered hyperspace. Destination unknown. Estimated arrival anywhere in human space, 72 hours. 72 hours to prepare for an enemy that could bend reality itself. 72 hours to decide whether humanity would face them as conquerors or something else. Reeves looked at the frozen armor in the plaza one last time, then began composing new orders. If they were going to survive what was coming, they would need every ally they could find, even ones who had arrived as enemies, especially those. The dawn light caught the frost on the abandoned hegemony armor, turning it into a field of diamonds. It was beautiful and terrible, a monument to victory and a warning of battles yet to come. But as the sun climbed higher, the frost began to melt, revealing the metal beneath, scarred but intact, waiting to be reclaimed and repurposed, just like the galaxy itself. Just like humanity's place in it. The real war was about to begin, but perhaps for the first time in galactic history, it wouldn't be won by those who could force others to kneel. It would be won by those who could convince them to stand. The ordnate ship didn't arrive like other vessels. It simply existed where emptiness had been before, reality bending around its crystalline hull like water around a stone. Admiral Reeves watched from New Tasmania's command center as every sensor on the planet screamed contradictory data. The ship was there. It wasn't there. It was 1,000 kilometers long. It was the size of a shuttle. It was all of these things at once. "Sir," Lieutenant Colonel Park's voice cracked, the first time Reeves had heard fear from the man. "Temporal readings are impossible. That ship exists in at least 7 different time streams simultaneously." Reeves forced his hands to remain steady on the command console. "Have they responded to our hails?" "No, sir, but they've sent something." The holographic display flickered, and suddenly a figure stood in the center of the command room. Not a transmission, not a projection, but somehow actually there, despite being light years away. The ordinate representative was beautiful in the way a mathematical equation could be beautiful, perfect, cold, and utterly inhuman. Its form shifted between states, sometimes bipedal, sometimes something else entirely. "Admiral Jonathan Reeves," it spoke without moving what might have been a mouth. "You have disrupted the pattern. The hegemony's defeat was not calculated. This deviation must be corrected. And if we refuse?" Reeves asked, proud that his voice remained steady. The ordinate tilted what might have been its head. "Refusal is not a variable we computed. You will be corrected." The figure vanished, leaving behind only the smell of ozone and the taste of copper. Through the viewports, the ordnate ship began to shift, its crystalline hull rearranging into configurations that hurt to perceive directly. "Incoming!" Park shouted, but the warning was unnecessary. Reality tore. There was no other way to describe it. Space itself ripped like fabric, and through the tears came things that shouldn't exist. Geometric shapes that violated three-dimensional physics, energy patterns that registered as both matter and void, attacks that arrived before they were launched. New Tasmania's defenses, so effective against the hegemony, were useless. Shields designed to stop energy and projectiles couldn't block something that existed outside normal spacetime. Buildings began to phase in and out of existence. People reported seeing themselves die before it happened, creating paradoxes that made them vanish entirely. In Shelter 7, Santos watched in horror as the hegemony prisoners he'd been guarding began to flicker like bad video feeds. One moment they were there, the next they were aged to dust. Then they were back, but wrong, inside out, or merged with the walls, or simply erased from reality. "What do we do?" someone screamed. Santos didn't have an answer. How did you fight an enemy that could rewrite the laws of physics? Captain Scott received the distress call aboard the Perseverance, already en route to synthesis space. The tactical data from New Tasmania made no sense. Weapons that struck before being fired, casualties that unhappened, entire city blocks that existed in multiple states simultaneously. "Sir," Commander Park reported, her face pale, "if the Ordnate can do this to a planet, they can do it to Earth," Scott finished. "To all of us." He closed his eyes, weighing options that all led to extinction. The Ordnate weren't just technologically superior, they operated on principles that made conventional warfare meaningless. It would be like ants trying to fight a human who could simply step outside their two-dimensional perception. Unless. Navigation emergency course change. Take us to the hegemony prison ship. "Sir?" "Now, Commander, and get me General Karavosh." On New Tasmania, Reeves watched his colony die in ways that defied comprehension. But amid the chaos, he noticed something the Ordnate apparently hadn't. The human technology was largely unaffected. Their computers still functioned, their weapons still fired, their basic infrastructure remained stable. Only the advanced technology seemed vulnerable to the reality distortions. "Park, implement Protocol 9. Park stared at him. "Sir, Protocol 9 is theoretical at best. We don't even know if—" "Do it." As Park's fingers flew across his console, Reeves opened a channel to every human on the planet. "All personnel, this is Admiral Reeves. Abandon all advanced technology immediately. Weapons, vehicles, communications, everything electronic. Return to basics, that's an order." Across New Tasmania, humans stripped off powered armor, abandoned energy weapons, shut down everything more complex than simple machines. It went against every military instinct, but they obeyed. In orbit, the Perseverance docked with the prison transport holding the captured hegemony command staff. Scott found Karavosh in a cell that was more guest quarters than prison, the general studying human history texts with an intensity that suggested obsession. "General," Scott said, without preamble, "I need your help." Karavosh's mandibles clicked. What Scott had learned was amusement. "The Ordnate have come for you, and now you understand what we all learned long ago. They cannot be fought." "Cannot? Or haven't been?" "What's the difference? They exist outside normal space. Their technology operates on principles we can't even comprehend. When they decide a species needs correction, that species ceases to exist. Not destroyed, erased, as if they never were." Scott sat across from the general, abandoning military protocol. "You said we all learned. That means other species have tried to fight them. And failed. The synthesis tried biological warfare. The Ordnate simply stepped outside biology. The Crowned Republic used their AIs. The Ordinate rewrote the mathematics the AIs were based on. Every advanced civilization has tried and failed because advancement itself is what makes us vulnerable to them. But what about non-advanced civilizations? Karvosh fell silent, his 6 eyes focusing on Scott with sudden intensity. You're thinking of something specific. I'm thinking, Scott said slowly, about why humanity survived its own nuclear age when most species self-destruct. I'm thinking about how we've always been better at destruction than creation. And I'm thinking about what happens when you strip away all the technology and just leave the human. On New Tasmania, the change was immediate. As humans abandoned their technology, the reality distortions seemed to slide past them. A Marine who had dropped his powered armor watched it phase through 17 dimensions while he remained untouched. Buildings full of advanced equipment collapsed into probability curves, but the humans who had evacuated them stood unharmed in the snow. Sergeant Major Crawford understood first. They can only affect what they can calculate, he told Santos as they huddled in a shelter that was nothing more than wood and stone. Complex technology follows predictable patterns. But humans are chaos, Santos finished. Crawford pulled out something Santos had never seen outside a museum, a chemical propellant pistol, its design unchanged for 3 centuries. Time to remind them why our ancestors feared the dark. The Ordinate on their ship noticed the anomaly within minutes. The humans weren't dying according to calculated parameters. They had shed their technological shells like insects molting, revealing something underneath that didn't fit the equations. When the first human shuttle approached their vessel, the Ordinate almost didn't notice it. It was too primitive to register as a threat. Chemical rockets, metal hull, navigation by manual calculation. It might as well have been a wooden boat approaching a battleship, which is why they didn't stop Marcus Kim and his volunteer crew from landing in what the Ordinate considered a waste disposal area. Kim had been an engineer 6 hours ago. Now he was something older, something his species had tried to forget. He and his team carried no energy weapons, no advanced equipment, just chemical explosives, mechanical timers, and the kind of determination that had once driven humans to cross oceans in wooden ships. Remember, Kim told his team as they planted charges throughout the Ordinate ship's crystalline structure, we're not trying to destroy it. We're trying to make it notice us. The explosions that followed were primitive by galactic standards. Chemical reactions, mechanical shockwaves, the kind of damage any species would have shrugged off once they achieved interstellar flight. But the Ordinate had never faced an enemy that moved backward technologically. Their predictive models couldn't account for deliberate primitivism. More importantly, they couldn't step outside reality to avoid an attack that operated purely within physical laws. General Karavosh watched from the Perseverance as more human shuttles launched, each one carrying volunteers who had stripped away centuries of advancement to become something the galaxy had forgotten. Humans as they truly were, without the mask of civilization. This is insane, he told Scott. You're attacking the most advanced species in the galaxy with chemical rockets and mechanical bombs. No, Scott corrected. We're reminding them that before we reached the stars, we spent 50,000 years learning to kill with sticks and stones. Technology isn't what makes us dangerous, General. It's what makes us safe. The Ordinate ship shuddered under the primitive assault, not from damage, but from confusion. Their reality-warping weapons required complex calculations, predictive models based on their enemies using comprehensible technology. But the humans weren't using technology anymore. They were using physics, chemistry, and bloody-minded determination. When the Ordinate tried to phase their ship out of normal space, they found they couldn't. The human explosives had created a field of chaotic reactions that made calculation impossible. When they tried to erase the attacking shuttles from existence, they found no complex patterns to unravel, just metal and meat and will. On New Tasmania, Admiral Reeves led the counterattack personally, not with energy weapons or powered armor, but with a rifle design that hadn't changed in 400 years, and the kind of tactical knowledge that every human child learned in history class. "Spread out," he ordered his troops as they advanced on ordinate ground forces. "No formations they can predict, no patterns they can calculate. Be what we always were, chaos given form." The ordinate ground forces, beings of pure mathematics and crystallized time, found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't model. Humans didn't advance in formation. They flowed like water, each individual making decisions based on instinct rather than optimization. When the ordinate tried to trap them in temporal loops, the humans' chaotic nature broke the loops through sheer unpredictability. Santos found himself face to face with an ordinate warrior, a being that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. By every law of physics, he should have been obliterated. Instead, he did what humans had done for millennia when faced with the incomprehensible. He attacked it with a sharpened piece of metal. The blade shouldn't have been able to touch something that existed partially outside reality, but the ordinate had made a fatal error. They had assumed that primitive meant predictable, that regression meant weakness. They had never considered that a species might choose to be primitive, might weaponize simplicity itself. The blade found its mark, and the ordinate warrior discovered that for all its technological superiority, it still needed certain biological processes to function. It collapsed, its perfect mathematical form disrupted by humanity's oldest solution to problems, pointed sticks and determination. Across the planet, similar scenes played out. The ordinate, faced with an enemy that defied their predictive models, began to retreat. Not a rout, but a careful withdrawal as they recalculated, tried to understand how a species could defeat them by moving backward. In space, the ordinate ship found itself surrounded by hundreds of primitive human vessels. No shields, no energy weapons, just metal boxes filled with explosives and humans willing to die. The kind of warfare that the galaxy had abandoned as barbaric and inefficient. But efficient had never been humanity's strength. Effective was. Captain Scott opened a channel to the ordinate ship. "This is Captain Thomas Scott of the United Earth ship Perseverance. You came here to correct us. But you made the same mistake every advanced species makes. You thought our tools were our strength." The response came as before, the ordinate representative appearing on his bridge. But now its perfect form showed cracks, uncertainty in its mathematical precision. "This is not possible," it said. "You cannot defeat us with primitive weapons." "We're not defeating you," Scott replied. "We're teaching you. Every species in the galaxy fears you because you can step outside reality, manipulate the laws of physics. But we just showed you what happens when someone chooses to step inside reality, to embrace the chaos you've spent eternity trying to escape." General Karvosh stepped forward, surprising everyone. He's right. The hegemony conquered through strength, but the humans conquered us through understanding. They knew we relied on our technology, so they turned it against us. Now they knew you relied on prediction, so they became unpredictable. The ordinate tilted its head, processing. "You would share intelligence with your conquerors." "They're not our conquerors," Karvosh said simply. "They're our teachers. They showed us that strength without wisdom is meaningless. Now they're showing you that perfection without adaptability to chaos is death." The crystalline ship in orbit had stopped its attack. Across New Tasmania, ordinate ground forces stood motionless, calculating. The perfect beings faced with a choice they had never computed: withdrawal in the face of primitive assault, or continued engagement with an enemy that grew more dangerous the less advanced they became. Admiral Reeves stepped forward in the snow, approaching an ordinate commander. He carried no weapon, wore no armor, just a human in basic clothing showing empty hands. "You came to correct us," he said. "But what needs correcting? We didn't defeat the hegemony through superior technology. We did it through mercy, turning enemies into allies. Now we're not defeating you. We're showing you that your greatest weakness is believing you have no weaknesses." The ordinate commander's form shifted through 17 different states before responding. "You would spare us? After we tried to erase you?" "That's what humans do," Reeves said. "We survive the impossible, forgive the unforgivable, and find strength in what others call weakness. We don't need to break your legs to make you kneel. We just need to show you why standing together is better than standing alone." The change came slowly. First, one ordinate, then another, began to shift their forms. Not the random shifting of before, but deliberate changes, trying to match human physiology. They couldn't fully succeed. They were too alien, too evolved beyond physical form. But the attempt itself was significant. In orbit, the synthesis fleet arrived to find not a battle, but a negotiation. Their biological weapons primed, their living ships ready for war, they instead found humans and ordinate working together to repair the damage to New Tasmania. The synthesis overmind, a collective consciousness spanning 1,000 bioships, found itself confused. The humans should have been erased. The ordinate should have been victorious. Instead, both species seemed to be learning from each other. Commander Eric Johansson of the UES Defiance greeted the synthesis fleet with characteristic human audacity. "Welcome to the party. We're teaching the ordinate about chaos. They're teaching us about reality manipulation. Want to join, or should we demonstrate what humans can do to biological systems with nothing but chemistry and bad intentions?" The threat was barely veiled. If humans could defeat the ordinate by abandoning technology, what could they do to a biological fleet with basic chemical weapons? The synthesis considered for exactly 0.003 seconds before responding. "We would observe." By the time the Crowned Republic's AI armada arrived, the situation had evolved beyond their calculations. New Tasmania had become neutral ground where 4 species, human, hegemony, ordinate, and synthesis, worked together to repair a world scarred by reality distortions. The AIs, for all their processing power, couldn't model what they saw. Enemies working as allies, victors treating the defeated as equals, technology being abandoned in favor of older methods that somehow worked better. Captain Scott met with the AI collective's avatar, a shifting hologram of light and data. "Let me guess, this doesn't fit your programming." "Correct. Humans should be subservient. The ordinate should be supreme. The synthesis should be consuming. The hegemony should be expanding. Yet none of these conditions are met." "Because we changed the rules," Scott said. "Every species in the galaxy built their identity around their strengths. The ordinate mastered reality, the synthesis perfected biology, you perfected thought, the hegemony perfected conquest. But humans, we never perfected anything, we just learned to adapt. Adaptation is inefficient. Adaptation is survival. And more than that, it's growth. The hegemony learned mercy from us. We learned precision from the ordinate. The synthesis is teaching us about biological harmony. And you, what do you want to learn?" The AI collective processed for several nanoseconds, an eternity in computer time. "We want to learn how you made them kneel without breaking them." Scott smiled. "First lesson. We didn't make them do anything. We showed them a choice, and they chose to kneel. Then we helped them stand. That's the difference between conquest and leadership." Within a solar week, New Tasmania had become something unprecedented in galactic history. A world where 5 species worked together not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. The hegemony provided labor. The ordinate bent reality to repair the damage they'd caused. The synthesis grew new ecosystems to replace what was lost. The AIs optimized the reconstruction, and the humans. The humans did what they'd always done. They adapted, learned, taught, and somehow made it all work. In the command center, Admiral Reeves stood with representatives from all 5 species. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger implications were just beginning. "Each of you came here as conquerors," he said. "Each of you had the power to destroy us. But power isn't strength. Breaking someone's legs to make them kneel isn't victory. True strength is getting someone to stand beside you by choice." The ordinate representative, its form now stable in only 3 dimensions, spoke first. "We calculated millions of scenarios. In none of them did we become allies." "Because you can't calculate choice," Reeves replied. "You can't predict mercy. You can't model hope. These aren't weaknesses. They're the strengths that let a species survive when logic says they should die." General Karvosh clicked his mandibles in what humans had learned was laughter. "The humans conquered the galaxy by refusing to conquer it. They defeated us all by showing us we didn't need to fight. The question," the synthesis overmind interjected, "is what comes next. This cooperation is unprecedented. It challenges every power structure in the galaxy." "Good," Scott said from the view screen where his ship patrolled the system's edge. "The old structures led to endless war, expansion for its own sake, strength without purpose. Maybe it's time for something new." "A confederation," the AI collective suggested. "A union of species." "Or," Santos suggested from where he stood guard, still carrying his ancient rifle out of habit more than need. "We could just be neighbors. Help each other when needed. Leave each other alone when not. You know, like humans used to do before we forgot how." The simplicity of it seemed to stun the alien representatives. Thousands of years of complex alliances, elaborate treaties, careful power balances, and a human private suggested they just be decent to each other. Yet, as they considered it, the elegance became apparent. No forced unity, no elaborate structures. Just the recognition that they were stronger together than apart, that diversity was strength, that choice mattered more than control. Over the following months, the galaxy watched in stunned disbelief as the 5 species formalized what became known as the Tasmania Accords. Not a treaty or an alliance, but a simple agreement. They would stand together against those who would force others to kneel, and they would help those who chose to stand. The hegemony reorganized not as scattered kingdoms, but as a true democracy, with Karvosh as their first elected leader. The ordinate stepped fully into reality, abandoning their crystalline perfection for messy but meaningful existence. The synthesis spread not through consumption but through invitation, sharing their biological mastery with willing partners. The AIs found something they had never calculated: purpose beyond optimization. And the humans. They did what they'd always done. They built ships that could cross the void and shacks that could weather any storm. They wrote poetry about mathematics and equations about love. They remembered how to fight with sticks and stones while learning to bend reality. They were chaos and order, primitive and advanced, merciful and terrifying. They were human. Captain Scott stood on Earth's orbital platform, watching ships from 5 species work together on humanity's newest project. Not a weapon or a defense, but a monument, built where everyone could see it, a reminder of what they'd learned. It was a simple sculpture, 5 figures, each clearly alien, helping each other stand. No one kneeling, no one above the others, just beings choosing to rise together. "Think it'll last?" Commander Park asked, joining him at the observation window. "Nothing lasts forever," Scott replied. "Someday, someone will come along who wants to make others kneel again. But now we know the answer to that." "Which is?" Scott smiled, thinking of General Karvosh learning human poetry, of ordinate children playing with human kids in New Tasmania's rebuilt streets, of synthesis gardens growing beside human farms. You don't break their legs. You show them why standing is better than kneeling. And if they insist on trying to conquer... He gestured to the shipyards visible in the distance where humans worked alongside their former enemies. "Well, we've gotten very good at reminding people that humans don't need technology to be dangerous. We just choose to be civilized." "Most of the time," Park added with a grin. "Most of the time," Scott agreed. As Earth turned below them, ships from across the galaxy continued to arrive. Not conquerors or supplicants, but neighbors, drawn by the impossible thing humanity had achieved. Not an empire built on force, but a community built on choice. The humans had shown the galaxy that making someone kneel was easy, making them want to stand with you. That was the real victory. And in the depths of space, on worlds across the spiral arm, species looked at humanity with new eyes. Not as conquerors to be feared or weaklings to be exploited, but as something far more dangerous and far more valuable. Teachers who led by example, warriors who chose peace, primitives who could break reality, and above all, survivors who refused to survive alone. The galaxy had learned a new phrase, whispered in 100 languages across 1,000 worlds: "Don't make the humans remind you what they are." Because what they were, at their core, was the species that looked at the word impossible and heard challenge. The species that could strip away 10,000 years of advancement and still win through sheer, bloody-minded determination. The species that conquered by choosing not to conquer. They were the species that broke the galaxy's cycle of conquest and submission, not through superior firepower or technology, but through something far more powerful: the radical idea that strength meant lifting others up, not pushing them down. Admiral Reeves retired 6 months after the Tasmania Accords were signed. His last official act was to oversee the integration of multi-species crews on human vessels. He spent his remaining years teaching at the academy, where human and alien cadets learned together that the greatest victories were the ones where everyone survived. Captain Scott took command of the first truly integrated fleet, with ships from all 5 species flying in formation. Their mission wasn't conquest or defense, but exploration. Pushing beyond the known galaxy to find new neighbors, new challenges, new impossible things to make possible. Santos never did become an officer. He stayed a private by choice, standing guard at the Tasmania Memorial where the first battle hadn't been fought, teaching young soldiers from a dozen species that sometimes the most important battles were the ones you chose not to fight. And in the depths of space, on a mission to the galactic edge, Marcus Kim, now Captain Kim, received a transmission from an unknown species. They had observed the changes in the galaxy, had seen conquest replaced by cooperation, had watched in disbelief as humans transformed enemies into allies. Their message was simple: "We have made others kneel for millennia. Show us how to help them stand." Kim smiled, remembering the day he'd attacked the most advanced ship in the galaxy with chemical explosives and determination. He composed his reply carefully, knowing it would echo through history. "First, you have to choose to kneel yourself. Not from weakness, not from defeat, but from the understanding that standing alone means nothing if others remain on their knees. Then, and only then, can you learn to rise together." The galaxy had changed, not through war or conquest, but through the simple, impossible act of choosing to be better. And at the center of it all were the humans, chaotic, adaptable, primitive when needed, advanced when necessary, and always, always too stubborn to accept that anything was truly impossible. They had shown the galaxy that true strength wasn't in breaking legs to force a kneel. It was in offering a hand to help someone stand. And in the end, that made all the difference. The end. In the years that followed, children across the galaxy learned the story of New Tasmania, not as a battle, but as the day the galaxy chose to stop kneeling. They learned about Admiral Reeves, who fought without fighting, about Captain Scott, who conquered through mercy, about Private Santos, who guarded enemies until they became friends. But most of all, they learned about humanity itself, the species that had spent 50,000 years perfecting war only to choose peace, the species that could strip away everything that made them civilized and still win through sheer determination. The species that looked at the galaxy's endless cycle of conquest and said simply, no. They learned that humans were dangerous not because they could break you, but because they could change you. They could take your greatest strength and show you how it was also your greatest weakness. They could make you question everything you thought you knew about power, about strength, about what it meant to be civilized. And in learning these lessons, the galaxy itself changed. Species that had been enemies for millennia found common ground. Technologies were shared rather than hoarded. Worlds that had lived in fear now thrived in cooperation. All because humanity had answered a simple challenge with a simple truth. You'll kneel when we teach you how to stand.